The sixth man left Bagrak Thunderroar's door with a bloody nose and his pride in tatters, stumbling down the steaming lane with one boot missing, and his coat torn at the shoulder. And the whole hot spring town of Sulphur Crossing watched him go with the mixture of relief and dark amusement that had become customary by now. Bagrak stood in the doorway of the low stone house, the house that had been hers in Grevax, and now was only hers, with her arms folded across her chest and her green eyes flat and unapologetic. She was tall, even for an orc woman, and the volcanic valley's perpetual steam haze curled around her silhouette like something out of a fever dream. She wore a fitted dark leather bodice laced tight from waist to collarbone over a deep-pressed linen shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and her travel trousers were tucked into knee-high boots worn soft and dark with years of use. A single iron bead was woven into one of the heavy black braids that fell past her jaw, a funeral bead, the kind orc widows wore for a year after the loss. She was still wearing it after 18 months. Everyone in Sulphur Crossing had noticed. None of them were brave enough to mention it. The man limping away was called Denton Hale, a pork merchant from the valley's northern road who had apparently decided that a widow with a house, a steady income from the mineral baths she maintained, and a set of shoulders that could manage a cartload of stone unassisted, was a fine prospect. He had come with a gift of salt-cured ham and a practiced smile, and Bagrak had listened to his pitch for exactly 3 minutes before she told him what she thought of it, and when he had tried to take her hand anyway, she had answered with her fist. That was the sixth. The town had been counting since spring. There had been the traveling factor from the lowlands who had come twice and been sent off twice. There had been the garrison sergeant who had brought flowers. There had been the dwarven trader who had, to his credit, lasted the longest before she threw his walking stick off the porch. There had been 2 others whose names people were already forgetting. The pattern was clear enough. Bagrak Thunderroar wanted no part of any of it, and anyone who pushed the matter got precisely what Denton Hale had just gotten. Standing at the edge of the crowd that had gathered to watch the spectacle, because it was always a spectacle now, men approaching her door had become a form of local entertainment, was a man nobody recognized. He was not from Sulphur Crossing. He was somewhere in his early 30s, lean and weathered in the way that comes from years outdoors rather than years of hardship, with dark hair grown a little long at the collar, and the careful, measured stillness of someone who had learned to be very quiet in places where noise got you killed. He wore a soldier's coat that had been stripped of all its insignia, the kind of deliberate decommissioning that told you he had walked away from something and wanted no part of it anymore. A short sword hung at his hip, more out of habit than aggression from the look of it. He carried a canvas pack over one shoulder, and a small bundle of what appeared to be papers, rolled and sealed with wax, in his right hand. He had been watching the whole exchange from the far end of the lane. When Denton Hale cleared the lane entirely and the gathered onlookers began to disperse, murmuring and chuckling, the stranger simply stood still for a moment, looking at the stone house with its low porch and the woman still framed in the doorway. Then he walked to the door. He climbed the 2 steps to the porch without hurrying. He raised his hand and knocked twice. Then he clasped his hands behind his back and waited. Bagrak Thunderroar stared at him. She had expected him to flinch, or to look away, or to offer some apologetic overture. He did none of those things. He simply stood there and looked back at her with steady, dark brown eyes that held neither fear nor anything she recognized as a proposition, and waited for her to decide what happened next. She took a long breath through her nose. "You just watch me break a man's nose," she said, her voice low and dry as the volcanic stone under the valley's feet. "I did," he said. "And you still walked up here." "I have business," he said, "not the kind that ends with me grabbing your hand." He lifted the sealed roll of paper slightly. "I'm looking for a guide. I was told in the last town that you know the Cinder Pass better than anyone in the valley." She looked at the papers. Then she looked at him again with the same flat assessment she gave everything. "Who told you that?" "Woman at the mineral bath on the south end. Her name was Marta. She said Bagrak Thunderroar was the only person who had crossed Cinderpass in winter and come back with both feet. He paused. She also told me to bring something to the door instead of my hands. He reached into the side pocket of his pack and produced a small wrapped package. Dried red fern. I was told you use it for the bath treatments. Bagrak looked at the dried red fern. This was, without question, not how the last 6 had opened. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I haven't agreed to anything." "I know," he said, and followed her inside. His name was Warren Garrison, and she got the story out of him in pieces over the next half-hour while she prepared tea on the stone and copper stove, and he spread the sealed papers on the table. He had been a soldier, as she had guessed, 8 years serving in the hill campaigns east of the Verk Range, fighting in border skirmishes that never quite became wars and never quite became peace, either. He had mustered out 14 months ago, taken what pay he had saved, and spent most of it on a quiet period of doing very little in a series of small towns. But the papers on her table were the reason that easy period was ending. The papers were a formal notice of assessment, signed and sealed with the crest of a man named Caldric Voss, who held the title of revenue collector for the entire Cinderpass territory by appointment of the valley's distant and mostly disinterested regional council. The assessment notice was addressed to a man called Hennick Tolaway, who ran a trade depot on the far side of the pass, and who was, according to Warren Garrison, the second cousin of Warren's late mother and the only blood he had left in the world worth calling family. The assessment was ruinous. The figure at the bottom of the page was more than 5 times the standard rate for a depot of Hennick's size. Bagrak had seen Voss's paperwork before. The man had been bleeding the valley's merchants and smallholders for 3 years, but this was the worst she had read. "He's been doing this all year," Bagrak said, reading the notice again. "He did it to the Murren family last spring. They couldn't pay, and Voss's men took the whole of their livestock." "I know," Warren said. "Hennick wrote to me 6 weeks ago. He can't pay this either. But if I can get to him before Voss's deadline, and with enough coin to argue a legitimate appeal before the regional council's circuit judge, there's a chance. The circuit judge comes through Duskgate on the other side of the pass in 3 weeks' time." 3 weeks, Bagrak said. "It's late in the season. The high road through Cinderpass has been closed since the last ashfall. There is one route and it takes 10 days minimum if the weather holds. Which is why I need a guide who has done it." She set the papers down. She looked at him across the low table. The firelight from the stove played across his face, and she noticed again that he was not looking at her with any of the familiar flavors of wariness or calculation or practiced appreciation that most human men brought through her door when they looked at an orc woman. He was looking at her like she was a person he was asking something of, and the straightforwardness of it was doing something quietly unexpected to the knot she kept permanently lodged below her sternum. "How much coin?" she said flatly. 40 silver marks, he said. 30 up front, 10 when we reached Duskgate. It was good money, more than she made in a slow month at the baths. She knew that, and he probably knew she knew that. "I'll want to see the coin," she said. "Not because I think you're lying. Because I think you've spent most of what you had, and I want to know what you've actually got." He reached into his coat without any visible offense at the request and produced a money pouch. He counted out 30 marks on the table. There was not much left in the pouch after that. "That's everything except about 8 marks, he said, answering the question she had not quite asked. "I've been living cheaply." She looked at the silver. She looked at his face. She had thrown Dent and Hale and all the others out before they could even get properly through their opening lines, and she was sitting here entertaining a stranger's pitch for a dangerous mountain crossing in bad season. She was aware that something about the way he had knocked on that door and then just stood there, patient as stone, had already shifted something in her before he opened his mouth. She thought about Grevak. She thought about the iron bead in her hair. She thought about the way this man's coat had had its unit insignia carefully removed, like he too had shed something he had not chosen and was trying to decide what came next. "Give me tonight," she said. Come back in the morning. I'll have an answer then." He nodded and collected the papers, leaving the 30 marks on the table because she had not pushed them back to him yet. He stood, shouldered his pack, and paused at the door. "Thank you for not breaking my nose," he said. It surprised a short, involuntary sound out of her, not quite a laugh, but the shape of one, and it must have surprised her face into something that almost resembled warmth, because his expression shifted fractionally in response, something briefly open in it before he composed himself again. "In the morning," she said. "In the morning," he agreed and left. She stood in the empty house for a long time after that, listening to the deep, mineral-scented hiss of the hot springs that ran beneath the valley floor, and the iron bead was cool against her cheek when she pressed her hand to her face in the dark. Warren spent the night at the town's only inn, a low-ceilinged building called the Steaming Cup that smelled powerfully of sulfur and weak ale, and that had 2 other guests, both merchants waiting for the road conditions to ease. He ate a plain meal, sharpened his sword by habit, and lay on the narrow cot without sleeping much. He had known about the 6 men. Marta at the bathhouse had told him with evident relish, warning him with the friendly efficiency of a person who has seen the same comedy enough times to want to save the next performer from it. He had processed the information and arrived at a simple conclusion. The woman was not interested in being approached as a commodity or a convenience, and the men who had tried it had gotten what they deserved. The obvious response was to not do that. It had not seemed complicated to him. In his experience, the simplest approach was usually the most honest one, and the most honest one was usually to say exactly what you wanted and why, and let the other person decide. What he had not prepared for was her face. He had known she was an orc, and he had been around enough of the world to have moved past the point where that produced any particular reaction in him. The hill campaigns had put him alongside orc scouts and orc allies often enough, and his commanding officer for the last 3 years of his service had been half-orc and the finest tactician he had ever served under. But knowing those things, and then standing at a door and having Bagrak Thunderroar look at him with those flat green eyes, and that absolutely immovable self-possession while steam curled around her in the afternoon light, that was a different category of experience entirely. She was striking in a way that went past his available vocabulary for it. She had a face built for weather, angular and strong and deeply expressive even in stillness, and she carried herself with the particular gravity of someone who had been tested and found that she did not break. The iron bead in her braid told him she was still in mourning, and he had noted that and filed it carefully away. He was not here for what the 6 men had been here for. He reminded himself of that several times before he finally slept. In the morning she opened the door before he knocked a second time, which he suspected was intentional, and she was already wearing her pack. The travel kit she had assembled was the kit of someone who knew the route and had done it before. Bedrolls bound tight, a deep-bellied pot, 2 pairs of extra wool wraps, a coil of rope, and a short broad axe at her belt for wood and ice, and whatever the mountain decided to throw at them. She had added a long canvas rain cover to her original outfit, cinched at the waist, but the dark leather bodice and rust linen shirt were underneath it, and the iron bead still caught the morning light. She had also packed provisions for 2, and she had not asked him to contribute to them yet, which was a form of professional generosity that made him feel quietly respected. 30 marks, she said, holding her hand out. He gave them to her. She pocketed them without counting them in front of him. Rules for the pass, she said, falling into step as they headed for the North Road. You do what I say when I say it without discussion. If I say stop, you stop. If I say run, you run. If I say we shelter for a day, we shelter regardless of the deadline. I have brought people through Cinder Pass and I have brought bodies back from it, and the difference was whether they listened. Understood, understood, he said. You have a sword, can you actually use it? Well enough for what we're likely to encounter, he said. What we're likely to encounter is ridge wolves, ice collapse, and the possibility of running into any of Voss's patrol riders who use the high trail to avoid the checkpoints. The wolves you can handle with the sword if you're not an idiot. The ice collapse you handle by doing exactly what I tell you. The patrol riders you handle by letting me handle them. Understood? Understood, he said again. He had said it twice now and meant it both times, and she glanced at him sideways from under the hood of the rain cover as they reached the first rise above the town, and something in her expression shifted a fraction. Sulphur Crossing fell away below them as they climbed, the steam vents sending white columns into the cold morning air, the mineral pools glinting in sulphurous yellows and pale blues. The volcanic valley was beautiful in a fierce and inhospitable way, all black rock and brilliant hot water and the smell of things cooking deep underground. Warren looked back at it once and then kept his eyes on the trail. "You have anyone waiting for you?" she asked after an hour, in the particular tone of someone asking not out of personal interest but because it was professionally relevant. "Someone who needs to know if you don't come back through." "No," he said, "just Hennick." Grevek was like that, she said, and it came out neutral but with a slight roughness at the consonant that told him it had cost something. He had no one on the other end either, made it worse somehow when he was gone, nothing to organize toward. He did not press. He simply said, "I'm sorry about your husband," quietly and without making a production of it, and she said, "Thank you," in the same register, and they climbed for another while in the kind of silence that had been opened up rather than closed down. By midday they were in the foothills proper, where the volcanic black rock gave way to the gray and ochre stone of the Cinderpass Range, and the steam faded behind them and the air went cold and clean and thin. They ate on the move, dried meat and flat bread, and Bagrak set a pace that challenged him without quite outpacing him, and he thought she was probably testing whether he had been honest about his conditioning. He kept up without comment. She noticed. The first night they made camp in a natural shelter beneath an overhanging slab of rock, enough protection to keep the wind off and the heat from the fire contained. The space was close. They ate a hot meal from the deep pot, a surprisingly good stew that she produced from dried components with the efficiency of long practice, and sat on opposite sides of the fire with the mountain dark all around them. 8 years in the hill campaigns, she said, not looking at him. Which unit? Thorn Regiment, 3rd Column. She turned and looked at him then, and something in her expression had changed. 3rd Column came through the Verk Range in the spring campaign 6 years ago, she said. Yes, he said. Grevak's brother fought in the Verk defense. He was at Red Pass. Warren said nothing for a moment. He knew what had happened at Red Pass. He had been part of it on the other side of it. The battle had been messy and brutal, and had ended in a negotiated withdrawal that both sides had been relieved by. "I didn't command anything at Red Pass," he said. "I was a line soldier. I followed orders I didn't always understand. I've been trying to put together a better understanding of what those orders meant to the people on the other end of them." She looked at him for a long time. "Did Grevak's brother survive Red Pass?" "I don't know," she said. "He disappeared. We never heard." She looked back at the fire. "You're not apologizing for it." "No," he said. "An apology from me wouldn't mean anything. I wasn't the man who gave the orders, and saying sorry doesn't give you the information you actually want." The fire hissed and popped. "The other men who came to my door," she said after a while, "every single one of them said something about my husband within the first 3 minutes. Some kind of acknowledgement designed to show they respected the grief, so I would be more receptive to whatever they were selling. I could hear the structure of it every time. What did you want them to say instead?" She looked at him again, and this time the flatness in her eyes had given way to something more complicated. "Nothing. I wanted them to not say anything about him unless they actually meant it. He was a real person. He is not a rhetorical device." "I know," Warren said. "I could tell that immediately. That's why I waited until you brought him up yourself." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away and the edge of her mouth curved barely for just a second. "You're very deliberate," she said, "for a soldier who says he was just following orders." "I was deliberate then too," he said. "I just wasn't deliberate about the right things. That's what I'm trying to fix." The fire burned down and they arranged themselves for sleep on opposite sides of the shelter, and before the cold got fully settled into the stone, she said into the dark, quietly and without emphasis, "His name was Grevek Ironmorow, and he died of a fever from a wound he got defending a merchant caravan from bandits. Not in a battle, not for anything large, just doing a job and getting unlucky." A pause. "He was a good man. He deserved a better story." "Most people do," Warren said. He heard her exhale, long and slow, like something being set down. They pushed through the second day in earnest, the trail rising steeply through switchbacks that looked navigable and were full of loose shale that punished any lapse in attention. Bagrak moved through it without difficulty, placing her feet with the surety of deep experience, and Warren matched her style, not trying to be fast but trying to be correct, weight balanced, momentum controlled. She watched him without being obvious about it and made no comment, which he was beginning to understand was her version of a positive assessment. On the afternoon of the second day, they found the first sign of Voss's patrol riders. It was a camp, abandoned but recent, with a fire ring of specific construction military, spaced logs for a controlled burn that would last through a cold night, and the hoof prints of at least 4 horses in the ashy mud at the trail's edge. "Voss's men," Bagrak said, crouching at the fire ring. "This is the high trail approach. They use it to move ahead of caravans and assess the loads before the merchants reach the valley checkpoints. Gives them time to set the numbers before anyone can argue." She stood. "4 riders a day ahead of us or less. If they're running the east slope route, we'll cross them at the Cinder Gate. Can we avoid the Cinder Gate? Not easily. The alternative adds 3 days. Warren did the calculation. 3 days past the Cinder Gate route put them at 13 days total. The circuit judge arrived in Duskgate in 21 days from now, but the formal session for appeals opened in 18. 13 days of travel left 5 days to prepare the legal argument, which Hennick's letter had said he needed help with. Add even 1 day for weather or unexpected delay, and it started to get uncomfortable. "We go through the Cinder Gate," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "but carefully." He was learning what careful meant to her. It meant moving at the gray hour before full dawn when patrol riders were stiff and under-retentive. It meant reading the way sound moved on the mountain and adjusting their pace to what they heard on the wind. It meant stopping not when tired but when the tactical situation made stopping wise, and moving not when rested but when the window was right. She made decisions the way a field commander did, quickly and with visible reasoning, and she briefed him on each one so he understood the logic rather than just the instruction. He appreciated that. He had served under officers who gave orders as a form of power display, and he had also served under the half-orc tactician who explained every decision as it was made, and the second approach had saved his life twice. Bagrak was operating on the same principle, and she clearly did not even notice she was doing it. It was just how her mind worked. He found himself watching her more than was strictly necessary for navigation. On the third evening they sheltered in a carved hollow that she referred to simply as the second rest point, a known way station among guides who worked the pass, with a stone door weighted against the wind and enough room for 2 people to sleep without touching if they were thoughtful about it. The space was smaller than the first shelter and warmer for it, and they sat side by side near the ventilation crack where she had built a small controlled fire, shoulders almost touching, eating from the pot by firelight. "Tell me about the campaign," she said. "Not the battles, the parts between the battles." He thought about it. "There was a lot of silence," he said. "Long marches where nobody talked because talking cost energy you might need. You got good at being with people without speaking. And then terrible at it back in civilian places, because civilian silence means something different. Civilian silence means you're expected to fill it. I find civilian silence restful," she said. "I find civilian conversation exhausting. Everyone wants to establish something." "What do you mean?" "Pecking order, sympathy, advantage. Even the kind people are always establishing that they're kind. They can't just be it." She stirred the pot. "Grevek was the only person I knew who could sit in a room without performing anything. He just sat." She glanced at Warren. You do that too. I learned it on the marches, he said. Maybe, she said. Or maybe it's what you were before the marches, and the marches just gave you a reason to keep doing it. He considered her. You're more observant than most people I've met, he said. I run a bathhouse in a town full of people who want to talk to someone who isn't part of their social web, she said flatly. You hear everything after a while. You either get good at reading people or you lose your mind. How long have you run the baths? 6 years. Grevek and I built the second pool together the year before he died. She paused. I almost sold the whole thing this spring. There was a buyer, would have given me enough to go somewhere else entirely. I decided not to. What made you decide? She was quiet for a moment. The second pool, she said. We built it together. I didn't want to let that go to someone who wouldn't care about it. The fire breathed between them. They were close enough that he could see the iron bead in her braid catching the light, and he thought about Grevek Ironmorow dying of a fever from a bandit wound on a road somewhere, dying in the ordinary ugly way that most people died, not in any story anyone would tell, and about the woman sitting next to him carrying that loss in a single iron bead for 18 months. What was the appeal, she asked suddenly. For you, when you walked up to the door. The appeal, he repeated. You watched Denton Hale leave with his nose broken and you still walked up. I want to know what you were thinking. He looked at the fire. I thought you seemed like a person who had already decided what she was not going to allow in her life, he said, and that the thing you were not going to allow was being treated like a convenience, which seemed entirely reasonable to me. So I thought if I didn't do that, and if I was straightforward about what I actually needed, I would at least get a fair hearing. That's all. That's all that was relevant to knocking on the door, he said. Everything else I noticed came after. She turned and looked at him, and her face was very close in the small space, and the firelight was doing something to the angles of her face that made his chest feel unreasonably tight. She had a scar along her jaw, a clean old one from something bladed and long ago, and it did not detract from anything. What else did you notice? She said. Her voice was quieter than usual. I noticed, he said carefully, that you are quite remarkable. He looked back at the fire before the admission could become something that made her feel cornered. That's all I'll say about it. We have a job to do. She was silent for a moment that felt very long. Warren, she said. Yes. You are the strangest man who has ever come to my door. I'll take that as a good thing, he said. It is, she said, and went back to the pot, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and neither of them moved farther apart. The cinder gate was not a gate but a narrow passage between two overhanging rock faces, where the trail compressed to perhaps 8 feet in width, and every sound echoed with unnerving clarity. They reached it in the early gray of the 4th morning, moving slow and quiet, with the thin snow of altitude dusting their shoulders. Bagrak stopped 30 yards short of the passage and held up a fist, and Warren stopped immediately. She listened. He listened too. The mountain gave them wind and the creak of cold rock contracting and something else, faint and rhythmic. The particular shuffling of horses kept waiting. She turned to look at him with her eyes steady and her jaw set. She held up 2 fingers. Then she made a questioning gesture toward the passage. He understood. 2 riders, passage blocked. He eased the pack from his shoulders quietly and left it in the lee of a boulder. He drew his sword, holding it low and unthreatening. She had the axe in her hand already. They moved up to the passage together, and when they came around the last shoulder of rock, there they were. 2 of Voss's patrol riders, mounted, wearing the blue-gray coats of the Revenue Office's enforcement arm, blocking the cinder gate with the particular casual arrogance of men who knew that anyone coming through this passage on foot had limited options. The larger one had a list in his hand. He looked at Bagrak first, and then at Warren, and then back at Bagrak. No unauthorized passage through revenue territory, he said. Where's your transit permit? There is no transit permit requirement for the Cinderpass route, Bagrak said. Her voice was completely even. It's a public mountain road. The Revenue Office does not have jurisdiction over it. Collector Voss has extended territorial authority to the pass, the rider said, by order of the Valley Council. "Show me that order," Bagrak said. "The rider didn't have it. They never had it because it did not exist." Voss operated on the assumption that people would back down rather than demand documentation, and most people did. Bagrak was not most people. The larger rider nudged his horse forward a step, and Warren moved to stand beside Bagrak, not in front of her and not behind her, but at her shoulder, his sword still low and his posture stating clearly that there were two of them and neither was going anywhere. The second rider, younger and with less conviction in his seat, looked at Warren's sword and at Bagrak's axe and did a quiet recalculation. "We can send word to the collector," the first rider said, trying to recover authority. "Send word," Bagrak said. "We will be through the passage by the time any answer comes back, and you do not have the documentation to legally detain travelers on a public road. If you attempt it anyway, I will take the matter to the circuit judge at Duskgate, who will be sitting in 3 weeks' time, and I will name you both in the complaint." The mention of the circuit judge did something to the riders that the sword and axe had not quite managed. They exchanged a look. The first rider put his list away with deliberate slowness, the gesture of a man preserving what dignity he had left. "Move along then," he said. They moved through the cinder gate without running, because running would have invited escalation, and when the passage closed behind them and opened into the broader eastern face of the pass, Warren exhaled slowly. "You've done that before," he said. "3 times," she said. "Voss has been pushing his jurisdiction further east every season, but the law is still the law, even if he doesn't act like it. The trick is knowing the law well enough to say it louder than his men say the opposite. Where did you learn property and transit law?" "From a very good solicitor named Paris who came through Sulphur Crossing 2 years ago and spent a week in my bath arguing cases with anyone who would listen," she said. "He was insufferable and brilliant, and I am very glad I paid attention." Warren laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised out of him, and it bounced off the eastern rock face and came back to them twice, and she looked at him with what he could only describe as approval mixed with something warmer and more private, and she did not look away for a beat longer than was strictly necessary. The eastern face of Cinder Pass was harder going than the western, longer and more exposed, with the trail cutting along ridge lines where the wind had an unobstructed run at them. They pushed hard through the 5th and 6th days, the weather holding in that reluctant way that winter weather sometimes did, gray and cold, but not yet punishing. On the 7th day the weather stopped holding. The storm came up from the south, which was unusual, and which Bagrak called with about 2 hours' warning based on the color of the southern horizon and the behavior of the ridge birds. She pushed their pace hard, and they made a rock shelter system she had used before, a series of natural chambers in the eastern cliff face that travelers over the generations had improved with stacked stone windbreaks, just before the first serious blast came through. They were stuck for a day and a half. The chamber was low and dim and warm from the wind blocks and their shared body heat and the small fire she built with the carried fuel, and there was nothing to do but talk and wait. They talked. They talked for a day and a half, and it was the kind of talking that happens when two people are cut off from everything else, and the normal social rationing of disclosure evaporates. She told him about how she and Grevek had met. She had been working a caravan guard route, and he had been one of the merchants being guarded, and he had been so obviously the worst merchant she had ever met, so gloriously bad at commerce and so genuinely unconcerned about it, that she had found him incomprehensible and then irresistible. She told him about the first winter they had spent in Sulphur Crossing, when the mineral bath operation was barely breaking even, and they had survived mostly on stubbornness and Grevak's questionable skill at cooking root vegetables. She told him about the morning she had found him feverish and not getting better, and the week after, and the silence after the week after. He told her about the last campaign he had been part of before he mustered out, a skirmish that had turned suddenly and badly, and that he had walked away from physically unhurt, but carrying something that had not had a name when he started walking, and still did not have a fully satisfying one. He told her about the year and a half since, drifting between small towns and doing occasional odd jobs, telling himself he was resting when he was really waiting to find something that felt worth directing his life toward. He told her about his mother's second cousin Hennick, who was the closest thing he had to an anchor, and who he had never been close to but who was, in the final accounting, family, and family meant something even when it was thin. On the second night of the storm, they were sitting very close by necessity and shared warmth, and she had been quiet for a while after he finished talking, and he had been watching the small fire and trying to be respectful of the silence. "Warren," she said, and her voice was different, lower and more stripped of the professional evenness she usually maintained. "Yes," he said. "I haven't talked like this with anyone since Grevak," she said. "This particular kind of talking, I had forgotten what it felt like." He turned to look at her. She was looking at him already. "I'm glad you're here," she said quietly. "I want you to know that, whatever happens after this road." Something opened in his chest and stayed open. He had been carrying a long-accumulated loneliness for so many years that he had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing an old scar. And her saying those words in that voice in the dark of the stone shelter, while the mountain howled outside, was like the scar suddenly reporting that it had actually been a wound all along, and that wounds could, apparently, close. "I'm glad I knocked twice," he said softly. Her mouth curved, and this time it was a full smile, real and unguarded, and it changed her face entirely into something that took his breath cleanly away. "You were so calm," she said, almost wonderingly. "You just stood there and waited, after watching me break that man's nose. You just stood there like you had all the time in the world." "I had knocked on a lot of doors that didn't open," he said. "I had learned to wait." She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on his knee, and her hand was warm and large, and she pressed it down with a steadiness that felt like a declaration. "I drove off 6 men," she said. "I was not expecting a 7th. I wasn't there for what the 6 were there for," he said. "I know," she said. "But Warren, I think somewhere between the door and this mountain, that stopped mattering." He turned his hand under hers and held it properly, fingers interlaced, and they sat like that for a long moment while the wind screamed past the stone chamber and the fire breathed between its banked edges. "I don't want to push you toward anything," he said. "The iron bead." She reached up with her free hand and touched the iron bead in her braid. She held it for a moment. Then she took it out. She held it in her palm and looked at it for a long, quiet beat. And then she set it carefully on the stone beside her, not discarding it but setting it down with intention, the way you set something down when you have held it long enough and are ready to hold something else. Then she turned to him and she kissed him, and it was not tentative and it was not brief. It was the kiss of a woman who had decided, and was showing him exactly what that decision looked like, warm and certain, and lit from the inside with all the heat that the last 4 days of proximity and conversation had been building toward. He kissed her back with everything he had, which turned out to be more than he had known he was carrying, and outside the mountain went on howling, and neither of them paid it any attention. When they finally broke apart, she pressed her forehead to his, her hand against his jaw, and he had one hand at the small of her back and the other in her hair, and they stayed like that for a long moment, breathing in the shared warmth. "10 silver when we reach Duskgate," she said, and there was a low, teasing warmth in her voice that he had not heard before. "Absolutely," he said. "Every mark." She laughed against his cheek, and the laugh was warm and private and entirely real, and he thought with sudden and complete conviction that this was the thing his life had been aimed toward, all the silent marches and all the drifting and all the doors that had not opened, and it had been worth every bit of it. They held each other through the rest of the storm. The weather broke on the morning of the 9th day, and they pushed hard down the eastern descent, covering ground at a pace that spoke of shared urgency and the particular efficiency of 2 people who had gotten very good at reading each other's rhythms over a week of mountain travel. They were no longer 2 individuals on a professional arrangement. They moved like a unit, checking terrain together, communicating in shorthand, stopping to share water and food without the politeness of strangers, and the warmth between them was open and easy and charged in a way that made the cold air around them feel irrelevant. They came down out of the pass on the 10th day in the early afternoon, and Duskgate spread before them in the wide eastern valley, a town 3 times the size of Sulphur Crossing, built around a river crossing and an old garrison fort that had been converted into a commerce hall. The smell of actual civilization, bread and horses and smoke from 100 chimneys came up to meet them on the slope. "Home stretch," Bagrak said. Warren looked out over the town and thought about Hinek Tolloway and the assessment notice and the circuit judge and all the work that was still ahead. Then he looked at Bagrak beside him on the slope, her cheeks flushed from the cold and her braid over one shoulder without the iron bead in it, and everything in him oriented toward her like a compass finding north. He took her hand on the slope and held it as they walked the last mile down into Duskgate, and she let him, and squeezed back once, which was enough. Hinek Tolloway was a compact, sun-weathered man of about 50, with the permanently worried face of someone who had spent the last year reading financial assessments and not sleeping well. He was waiting at the gate of his trade depot, having had a letter from Warren saying approximately when they would arrive, and when he saw them coming down the main road, he rushed out to meet them with the relief of a man greeting reinforcements. The depot was a series of connected buildings around a central yard, well-maintained and clearly productive, which was entirely the point. Voss's assessment had targeted Hinek specifically because his business was visibly successful and therefore visibly worth squeezing. They spent the first evening unpacking the legal situation over a large, enthusiastic dinner that Hinek produced with the enthusiasm of a man who had been too anxious to cook properly for months. He was clearly a good man underneath the anxiety, the kind of man who thanked you for each thing as it happened and meant it each time, and Warren felt the thin thread of family feeling that connected them become something warmer and more real over the course of the meal. Bagrak and Hinek negotiated a different kind of connection almost immediately. She had dealt with Voss's paperwork in Sulphur Crossing, and she understood the revenue code, and Hinek had spent months digging into the law looking for leverage, and had found pieces that, combined with what she knew, began to look like a real argument. By the end of the evening, they were deep in the documents together, trading citations back and forth with the intensity of people who had found a common weapon and were learning how to wield it. Warren watched the two of them work and felt something warm and expansive in his chest that had nothing to do with Hinek's stew. They had 8 days before the circuit judge's session opened. They used all 8 of them. The legal situation was not simple. Caldric Voss had been careful, in the way that corrupt officials usually were, careful enough to make the wrongdoing hard to prove and easy to obscure behind procedure. The assessment of Hinek's depot was technically within the outer limits of the collector's statutory authority, if you read the authority broadly, and ignored several constraining precedents that the regional council had never formally tested. The circuit judge was a woman named Myra Selden, who had a reputation for following the letter of the law meticulously, which was either very good or very bad depending on how cleanly they could frame the argument. Bagrak had a critical piece of it. She had documentation from 3 other businesses in the Sulphur Crossing area that had been assessed at similar rates, and that had paid because they did not have the resources to fight. If she could get those business owners to Duskgate, or at least get sworn statements from them, the case shifted from a single disputed assessment to a pattern of systematic overcharging, which was a different legal category entirely. She sent letters. 2 of the 3 business owners agreed to provide statements. The third, a man named Culver who ran a tanning operation on the valley's western edge, sent a letter back saying that he was afraid of what Voss would do to his business if he cooperated, and could not take the risk. Bagrak rode back to Sulphur Crossing herself, in the middle of the preparation week, alone on a borrowed horse, to get those statements in person and deal with whatever Culver's actual concerns were. She was gone for 4 days, and Warren was aware the entire time of the particular anxiousness of missing someone specific. The way the air in the room had a different quality, the way he caught himself listening for a particular footstep. She came back with both statements and with Culver himself, having apparently persuaded him by a combination of legal argument and the sheer force of her conviction that Voss needed to be stopped before he had stripped every independent operation in the valley down to nothing. The evening before the circuit judge's session opened, she came back to the room in Hennick's depot that they had been sharing for the week, and Warren was at the table going over the argument outline one more time, and she came in and set her pack down and crossed to him without saying anything and bent, and kissed him with a thorough and unhurried warmth that rearranged his entire evening. "We have one night," she said, "before tomorrow is complicated. I would like to spend part of it not thinking about Caldric Voss." "An extremely reasonable position," he said, and set the papers aside. What passed between them that night was deep and warm and thoroughly real. Two people who had found each other in the hard country of the mountain, and who had been circling this particular warmth for days, finally allowing it full reign. It was not desperate, but it was intense, and it was the kind of intimacy that builds in stages and arrives somewhere that feels both new and entirely inevitable. She was warm and powerful and completely present, and he was careful and attentive in the way he was with everything that mattered to him. And afterward they lay together in the close dark of the depot room with the river sounds coming in through the wooden shutter, and she drew her fingers slowly through his hair, and he held her against his side with his arm around her shoulders, and neither of them spoke for a long while. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said eventually, "I'm glad we took this road." "The road isn't done," he said. "There's still whatever comes after the road." She tilted her head to look up at him. "What do you think comes after?" "I was hoping," he said, "that you might tell me." She was quiet for a moment. "Sulphur Crossing," she said, "the baths, the second pool that Grevak and I built. There's a room behind the main building that we never finished because we ran out of time. I have been running out of reasons not to finish it." She paused. "I think I have a reason now." He pulled her slightly closer and pressed his lips to the top of her head. "Yes," he said simply. "Just yes," she said. "What else would I say?" She laughed quietly against his chest, and that was the end of that conversation, and the beginning of something else entirely. The morning of the circuit judge's session came gray and cold and busy, with Duskgate filling toward the Commerce Hall from all directions. The session had been announced for public proceedings, which meant the whole of the town and the surrounding valley could come and watch, and they had come. Caldric Voss arrived with 6 men, which was the maximum escort a collector was permitted to bring to a legal proceeding, and he arrived in good clothes and with an excellent solicitor, a lean man named Frath who had the careful face of someone paid to find the weakest point in any argument and drive through it. Voss himself was broad and well-fed and expensively comfortable in his arrogance, the way men were when they had operated without challenge for long enough to mistake that for safety. He saw Bagrak in the crowd outside the Commerce Hall, and his expression flickered with something that was not quite recognition and not quite contempt but lived in the space between them. She met his eyes and did not look away. "Thunderroar," he said, "I didn't expect to see you this far east." "I go where the work is, collector," she said. "Filing a complaint, are you?" His voice carried the smooth confidence of a man who had seen complaints before and had outlasted all of them. "Judge will require documentation." "I have documentation," she said, and tapped the leather satchel at her side. "I have documentation from 4 businesses. I have 3 witnesses. I have the statutory history of your authority's limits and the precise precedents that constrain your assessment rate. And I have a man who used to be a soldier and who is very difficult to intimidate." She looked past Voss to where Warren was standing at the edge of the crowd, watching. Warren met Voss's eyes without expression. "Good morning, collector." Voss looked at Warren and then back at Bagrak, and then at the Commerce Hall doors with the controlled expression of a man recalculating. "This should be interesting," said Hennick from somewhere behind Warren's shoulder, and his voice was still worried, but it had a new note in it, something close to faith. The proceedings inside the Commerce Hall were formal and long, and conducted with Judge Myra Selden's exacting and impartial precision. She was a small human woman of about 60 with iron-gray hair and the unhurried authority of someone who had been doing this for 30 years and had heard every kind of argument the law could produce. She listened to Frath's opening presentation of Voss's statutory authority with total attention and no visible reaction. She listened to the opposing argument, which Bagrak presented herself, with Hennick providing supplemental testimony with the same unreadable attention. The Commerce Hall was full. Every merchant, every smallholder, every farmer and trader who had been anywhere near Voss's expanding jurisdiction in the last 3 years had come. They filled the benches and stood along the walls and spilled out the side doors into the cold street, where a crowd had gathered to listen through the open windows. It was the kind of crowd that had been waiting for this particular moment for a long time and was collectively holding its breath. Bagrak stood at the claimant's table in the center of the hall and laid out the case with a precision that Warren, watching from the gallery, had not quite anticipated, even knowing what he knew about her. She had the documents organized by date and legal provision, and she presented the pattern of assessments, 4 businesses, all significantly over the statutory ceiling when you applied the constraining precedents as a systematic and deliberate overcharge rather than an administrative error. She named the precedents by citation. She had Culver testify about the coercive pressure to not come forward. She had the other 2 business owners verify their statements in person. Frath cross-examined and was thorough and sharp, and there were moments when the argument turned technical enough that the crowd in the gallery held very still, trying to follow the thread. But Bagrak had spent 8 days preparing for exactly those moments, and she did not flinch or lose the thread of it, and more than once Judge Selden's expression shifted fractionally in a way that suggested she was following Bagrak's reasoning and finding it sound. The moment that turned the room entirely came in the late afternoon, when Voss himself chose to speak in his own defense, which Frath had visibly not advised, and which Voss did anyway with the confidence of a man who had always talked his way through things. He made the mistake of referring to the sulfur crossing assessments as accommodations for the administrative complexity of the ore-cooperated commerce in that region, and the word choice landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. Warren in the gallery watched the crowd's face change. Judge Selden set down her stylus. "Collector Voss," she said, with the particular quiet that very controlled people used in place of volume, "are you suggesting that the applicable rate was adjusted based on the ethnicity of the business operator?" There was a silence in the room that was almost physical. Voss understood what he had done. He tried to walk it back. Frath was already looking at the ceiling with the expression of a professional who could see his day's work crumbling. Bagrak stood at the claimant's table with her arms at her sides and her chin level and her face absolutely still. Warren could see, from where he sat, that she was controlling something very large very deliberately. Selden made a note. Then another. The ruling took 3 hours after the testimony closed, which was longer than usual, and which Dusgate interpreted correctly as the judge taking her time to write something thorough and unambiguous. When she returned to the hall and read it into the official record, the gallery was so quiet that the river outside could be heard. The assessment of Hennick Tollaway's depot was reduced to the legal rate, which was approximately 1/6 of what Voss had charged. All excess payments made by Hennick over the past 2 years were to be returned within 90 days. The assessments of the other 4 businesses were reviewed and similarly corrected. Collector Voss was formally censured, and his territorial authority was reduced to its statutory bounds pending a review by the Regional Council, which Selden noted she would be recommending in her report. She also noted in the last paragraph of the ruling that the raising of an ethnic qualifier in a financial assessment proceeding constituted a serious breach of the collector's code of conduct and had been noted in the official record. The gallery erupted. Not in a disorganized way, not in the way of a crowd that had gotten a spectacle, but in the deeper way of people who had been waiting for the world to be fair about something and were finally getting it. Hennick made a sound beside Warren that was somewhere between laughter and tears and grabbed Warren's arm. Around them, merchants and farmers were standing up and talking at once, and the release of collective held breath was almost a physical sensation. Through the press of the crowd, Warren found Bagrak. She was standing just inside the Commerce Hall doors with the legal satchel in her hand and Culver beside her pumping her arm in thanks, and the controlled stillness of the proceeding had given way to something more open in her face, something that looked like satisfaction and something else, something that looked very much like relief, not about the legal outcome, but about something larger, like a weight she had been carrying through the whole of the pass, and before it had finally been set down properly. He reached her through the crowd and did not say anything clever or congratulatory. He simply put his arm around her and held on, and she turned into him and pressed her face briefly against his neck and let out one long, slow breath, and then she straightened and looked up at him. 10 silver, he said. She laughed, a real and unguarded laugh that carried over the noise of the room, and he leaned down and kissed her in the doorway of the Duskgate Commerce Hall with the whole town milling around them. And if anyone had a problem with the sight of a human soldier holding an orc woman and kissing her in public after winning a legal case against the most disliked man in the valley, they were very thoroughly in the minority. Voss left Duskgate 2 days later with his escort and his censure, and whatever calculations he was making about his future, and Warren found he did not spend any time thinking about him. The man had been a problem and the problem had been dealt with, and there was the whole of the rest of life to attend to. Hennick threw a dinner that lasted most of the night and spilled out into the depot yard around a large fire, with half of Duskgate and the Eastern Valley attending and bringing food and drink, and an enormous collective sense of relief. Warren sat beside Bagrak with her shoulder against his and her hand, occasionally finding his under the table, and Hennick made a speech that managed to be both heartfelt and impressively brief, and Culver told a long story about his grandfather that nobody entirely followed, but that everyone found very funny by the end. At some point late in the evening, when the fire had burned lower and the crowd had thinned to the people who belonged to the long hours, Hennick sat down across from Warren with 2 cups and gave him one and looked at him with the direct consideration of a man who had something he wanted to say properly. "Your mother's family was always the quiet branch," Hennick said. "We didn't see much of you. I regret that now." "We have time to fix it," Warren said. Hennick looked at Bagrak, who was on the other side of the fire engaged in an animated conversation about past conditions with 2 other guide-experienced travelers, her gestures wide and her voice carrying the warmth of someone who had been careful with it for a long time and was allowing herself to use it freely. "She is remarkable," Hennick said. "Yes," Warren agreed. "Are you going back to Sulphur Crossing?" "Yes." "Good," Hennick said simply and raised his cup. "Good." They stayed in Duskgate for 4 more days, helping Hennick organize the formal paperwork for the assessed repayments, and dealing with the secondary complications that any legal victory tends to generate other businesses wanting guidance on their own situations. The circuit judge's clerk requesting supplemental documentation for the regional council report. Frath the solicitor making a surprisingly gracious appearance to inform them that he had declined to renew his engagement with Collector Voss, and that he considered the case well argued. On the last evening before they left, Warren walked with Bagrak along the river road at the edge of Duskgate, where the cold water moved dark and clear in the winter evening light and the town sounds were muffled enough to give them room. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that whatever your answer is, it doesn't change anything I've said or done or what I want for this." She looked at him steadily. "Ask." I told you I don't have anyone waiting for me, he said. And I don't want anyone else. I want to come back to Sulphur Crossing with you and help you finish that room behind the baths and be the person who is there when you come home. He met her eyes. I know that's a large thing to say after 2 weeks. 2 weeks on a mountain in a storm, she said. Yes, which in my limited experience covers a lot of ground. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the dark river. Then she said, the room behind the baths needs a new roof beam. The old one rotted through 2 winters ago, and I have been using the space for storage because I could not decide what else to do with it. He waited. If you can put up a roof beam, she said, you can stay. He looked at her. I know how to put up a roof beam, he said. I know, she said. I watched how you set up camp. You think about structure. She looked at him, and her eyes were warm and direct and entirely unguarded in a way that he had come to understand she reserved for very specific moments. Warren, yes, I want you to come back to Sulphur Crossing with me. I want you to be the person who is there. I have been on my own for a long time, and I had decided that was how it was going to be. And then you knocked twice and stood there like you had all the patience in the world. And now I am standing by a river in Duskgate, and I am very much in love with you, and I would like you to come home. He stepped to her and put his hands on her face, and she put her hands on his chest, and he kissed her in the winter evening light over the dark river, slow and thorough, and with the particular tenderness of someone who knows what they have and is not taking any of it for granted. I'm coming home, he said. She pressed her palm flat against his chest over his heart and held it there. Good, she said. The roof beam won't lift itself. He laughed and she laughed with him, and they walked back along the river road into the lit warmth of Duskgate, shoulder to shoulder, his arm around her, and the cold was completely irrelevant. The return through Cinder Pass was different from the crossing east in the ways that mattered and the same in the ways that were good. The weather was still cold, but it was clear, the ashfall from the western volcanic range having settled, and the trail was better defined under a skim of old snow. Bagrak set the same pace and briefed him on the same tactical points, and he followed her lead with the same willing attention. But there was nothing professional about any of it now. It was 2 people who knew each other's rhythms traveling together, checking each other instinctively, sharing the work and the load and the warmth of the small fire each night without any of the early careful distance. They slept close and warm and talked without rationing themselves, and he learned more about her mother's people from the northern clan country, about the caravan routes she had worked for a decade before she and Grevak had settled, about the specific point at which she had understood that she was good at something that most people were afraid of, which was reading the mountain's mood and moving accordingly. And she learned more about him, about the first unit he had served in, about the particular injury that was not quite a wound and not quite a scar, but that had been making him sleepless for 14 months, about the way he had been trying to find what he was supposed to do next, and had stopped finding it when he stopped looking and just followed the most direct available path. The most direct available path, she said on the 3rd night of the return crossing, watching him across the fire, was a knock at my door. Yes, he said. It turned out to be the exact right path. Marta at the bathhouse is going to be insufferable about this, she said. Almost certainly, he agreed. She will feel vindicated for suggesting you come to me. She absolutely will. She will probably tell the story every day for a year. A reasonable consequence, he said. Bagrak shook her head, but she was smiling, and the smile was the wide-open one that still did something unjust to his ability to think clearly. And he crossed to her side of the fire because the distance had become genuinely unreasonable, and she made room for him with the easy familiarity of someone who had already decided this was where he belonged. They came through Cinder Pass on the 7th day of the return and began the descent toward the volcanic valley, and the first steam columns became visible from the ridge, white against the winter sky, and then the particular smell reached them, mineral and warm and strange, the smell of deep earth breathing. Home, Bagrak said quietly on the ridge. Home, Warren agreed. He had not said that word and meant it in years. Sulphur Crossing had a certain kind of awareness that small towns have, the kind that picks up changes in the social fabric before they are officially announced. And by the time Bagrak and Warren walked in from the North Road, several people were already watching from doorways and windows with the particular attentiveness of people whose expectations are being reorganized. Marta, at the mineral bath on the south end, heard the news within the hour and appeared at the bath's front porch as they passed, and the expression on her face was the precise expression of a woman who had predicted exactly this outcome and was taking deep satisfaction in having been correct. "Red Fern," she said to Warren with the significant emphasis of someone making a point. "It worked," he confirmed. She looked at Bagrak. Bagrak looked back at her. Something passed between them that involved Marta's eyebrows rising and Bagrak making a short, dismissive gesture with her hand that managed to be simultaneously denying and confirming everything. "Welcome back," Marta said simply. "The southern pool needs resealing on the eastern edge. I have been waiting for you." "I'll look at it tomorrow," Bagrak said. The stone house was cold from standing empty, and they built the fire up together in the first half hour, and Bagrak went through the stored provisions with the efficiency of someone reorienting to a space she knew in the dark, and Warren looked at the room behind the main building through the connecting door, the one that had been used for storage, and studied the rotted beam in the roof line and the general state of the walls, and began making calculations. The room could be good. It would need work, but the bones of it were sound and the space was generous, and it caught the morning light from the east window in a way that would be very pleasant once the storage crates were cleared. He told her this. She came and stood in the doorway of the room and looked at it with him. "I kept telling myself I would deal with it when the time was right," she said. "The time is right," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "it is." The weeks that followed were busy in the good way, the way that comes from having actual reasons to get up and actual things to accomplish and someone to do them alongside. Warren sourced the roof beam from a timber merchant 2 towns north, negotiated a fair price that turned out to be his best skill in a non-military context, and got it home on a borrowed cart with Hennick's contribution of 2 strong hired hands who had come west with the first repayment installment. The work on the room took most of a month, fitted in around Bagrak's work at the mineral baths and the ongoing activity of the legal aftermath. There were letters from the regional council's investigator, supplemental documents to prepare, and eventually a formal notice from the council that Caldric Voss had been suspended from his position, pending a full audit of his records. That notice arrived on a clear, cold morning, and Bagrak read it at the kitchen table and then set it down and looked at it for a moment. "Done," she said. Warren poured tea and set a cup in front of her and sat down across from her. "Done," he agreed. She looked up at him. "Culver sent a letter. He is thinking of organizing the affected businesses into a formal trade association with a shared legal resource. Good idea. He asked if I wanted to be part of it. What did you tell him?" "I told him I would think about it." She wrapped her hands around the teacup. "I think yes. I think Sulphur Crossing needs a voice in whatever the Valley does next about the revenue code." "I think so too," he said. She looked at him across the table with the open, warm look that he had been learning to read in all its gradations. This particular version was the one he associated with her being about to say something real and direct. "Warren," she said. "Yes." "I am very happy," she said. It came out simply, without decoration. "I want you to know that. I am happy in a way I did not expect to be again, and it is because of you, and I want to say it clearly rather than assume you know." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I know," he said, "but I like hearing it." "Then I will say it more often," she said, and turned her hand to hold his properly. And outside, the volcanic valley breathed its deep, mineral-scented steam into the winter air, and the hot springs glinted in all their impossible colors, and the stone house was warm. By late spring, the room was finished. It was a good room. The new beam sat solid and true in the roof line. The walls had been replastered and whitewashed. The east window had been reglazed with proper panes, instead of the oiled paper stopgap that had been there before, and the floor had been relaid in the flat volcanic stone that the valley quarried and that held heat beautifully. Bagrak had chosen a blue-green dye for the single curtain on the window, the color of the copper sulfate pool, and Warren had built a low bookshelf for the east wall that held their combined small libraries, his 3 military histories and her 2 volumes of valley flora and the law text she had ordered from a solicitor's supplier in Duskgate, and the travel journal she had kept since the caravan days, and which she had, in a gesture that meant more than she made it seem, set on the shared shelf. There was a chair in the corner that was definitively his, and a place at the work table that was definitively hers, and they both used each other's spaces without ceremony, which was its own kind of declaration. Marta came to see the room and inspected it with the manner of a woman conducting a professional review, and declared the bookshelf excellent and the window glazing superior and the overall result very satisfying. And then she said to Warren, with the directness of a person who had been building to this point for some time, "You are good for her, and she is good for you, and I would like you to know that I consider the red fern to have been a very sound investment." "I agree entirely," Warren said. "Marta," Bagrak said from across the room, in the tone of someone who has been tolerating a considerable amount. "I am leaving," Marta said, in the tone of someone who has said what she came to say and is entirely satisfied. She left. Bagrak looked at Warren across the finished room and he looked back at her, and the expression on her face was the layered one, dry and warm and thoroughly alive, that he had come to love above most things, and he thought about the iron bead that she had set on the stone in a mountain shelter in the dark of a storm, and about the door she had opened, and the door that had been opening ever since. The summer brought good business to the mineral baths, and the trade association that Culver organized began to take shape with Bagrak as one of its more active voices. She had a gift for the legal and administrative side that she had not fully known she had until the Duskgate proceedings had shown it to her, and she found she liked using it. There were 2 more letters from the regional council's investigator about the Voss case, and she answered them thoroughly and without drama, and by the time the formal audit concluded in late summer with findings that confirmed everything she had argued in Duskgate, it was something she could read over breakfast and set aside and get on with the day, because the day had a lot in it. Warren found work as a guide himself. After a while, shorter routes than Cinderpass, the lower valley trails that the eastern merchants used through the autumn season, and occasionally as a contracted security escort for the trade association's members on the higher-risk routes. He was methodical and reliable, and he did not take on more than he could do well, and the reputation he built was the quiet, durable kind that does not come from self-advertisement. He brought the earnings home, and they went into the household pool without any particular negotiation required, and he spent his days off at the baths helping Bagrak with the physical maintenance work, which was considerable, and in the evenings they cooked together and read together and talked about everything and nothing in the easy, unhurried way of 2 people who have nothing left to prove to each other. He was not lonely anymore. He noticed this the way you notice a sound that has been present for so long that when it stops, the absence is startling. The loneliness had been so constant that he had stopped identifying it as a specific condition, had just accepted it as the texture of his life. And now it was gone, replaced by the particular fullness of a life in which someone wanted to hear what you had thought about and touched your arm as they passed by and lit up, however subtly, when you came home. She wanted him. Not as a transaction, not as a convenience, not as a replacement for something lost. She wanted him specifically, the particular man he was, with his silences and his careful attention and his ability to put up a roof beam and his willingness to knock twice and wait. She said so. In the direct and undecorated way, she said all the things that mattered, and he believed her completely. One evening in the autumn, Almost exactly a year from the day he had walked up her porch steps. They sat on the low wall at the edge of the largest mineral pool as the last light went out of the sky, and the water glowed faintly with its own mineral heat. The valley steam rose all around them, white against the deep blue of the cooling evening, and the town's lights were coming on one by one in the windows down the slope, and somewhere in the distance a horse was having an opinion about something. Bagrak had her hair loose. She rarely wore it loose, but in the evenings at the baths when the work was done she sometimes let it down, and it was long and heavy and very dark, and there was no iron bead in it. There was something else. A small carved stone bead, dark gray shot through with a mineral vein of red, the kind that orc women wore when they had made a choice, when they had decided that a particular person was theirs and they were that person's. It was a custom of her mother's people, old and simple and direct, and she had woven it into her braid that evening without explanation, and Warren had looked at it and not yet asked. He asked now. She looked at him. Her face in the evening light was open and steady and absolutely certain. "It means I have made a choice," she said. "It means you are mine and I am yours. It is the way my mother's people said what some people say in other ways." She reached up and touched the bead. "I wanted you to see me choose, clearly and on purpose, not by accident and not by slow erosion. I am choosing you, Warren Garrison, with my eyes open and my whole mind made up." He looked at her and felt the deep, warm, unmovable thing in his chest that had taken up residence there somewhere between the mountain and the hot springs and had not gone anywhere since. He reached out and took her hand. He held it with the same careful attention he brought to everything that mattered to him, and she held his in return with the particular steadiness that was entirely her own. "Then I am chosen," he said, "and you are not alone, and neither am I. And I intend that to be permanent." "It is permanent," she said simply. "I do not make choices I do not mean." "I know," he said. "It's one of the things I love most about you." The valley breathed around them, mineral and warm and strange and entirely theirs, and the water of the pool glowed softly in the dark, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they sat there on the wall of the place they had built their life in, listening to the deep earth breathe. The hot springs of Sulphur Crossing never went cold. They had been running from the volcanic deep for longer than the town had existed, and they would run after it was gone. But tonight they were exactly right, and the two people sitting at the edge of them were exactly right, and whatever the road had been, it had come to exactly the right place. He had knocked twice and waited patiently, and she had opened the door, and neither of them had looked back since.